Hello, everybody. Welcome to Factual Foundations of Policy, a production of the Hoover Institution's Tannenbaum Program for Fact-Based Policy, where we impartially investigate the most controversial and important public policy issues facing the United States and indeed often the world. I'm Michael Boskin, the Rosen Milton Friedman Senior Fellow on Public Policy here at Hoover, the Tully M. Friedman Professor of Economics at Stanford, and former Chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Today, the topic of our show is how America can generate policies that provide the conditions for the production of durable, efficient, and, as necessary, clean energy resources, while also preserving our natural environment. But to generate constructive policies, we need to cut through the noise on what can be a contentious debate and rely on a solid foundation of facts. Joining me in conversation today are three highly regarded, distinguished experts who have spent much of their careers working on these subjects, and indeed are regarded as among the most important speakers and scholars on this globally. Arun Majumdar, one of the nation's leading voices on creating a sustainable energy future. He served as Undersecretary of Energy, and among many posts he has at Stanford. He is currently the founding dean of the Dorr School of Sustainability, and he was also the J. Precourt Provostial Chair Professor and a Senior Fellow here at Hoover. Bjorn Lomborg is a visiting fellow here at Hoover, is also president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center. His work highlights and advocates for efficient, evidence-based strategies to address the world's most pressing challenges, including climate change, but also global poverty and access to efficient energy resources. Daniel Yergin is a leading authority on energy, perhaps the leading authority on energy, geopolitics, and the global economy. The winner of the Pulitzer Prize, he has been referred to by the New York Times as America's most influential energy pundit. Indeed, when I want to start thinking about energy, I start with Dan, and often that's sufficient. Also, he is currently vice chairman of SP Global. So with all three guests who contributed to an ongoing series of readable and accessible essays that are available at hoover.org/Tannenbaum. Please access those if you'd like to read more about these subjects. Let's start, however, after a welcome to our very special podcast. Let's start by asking a series of questions and ask each of them to comment as necessary, as desirable. And feel free, we'll go with the flow. Feel free to work in anything you want to say. We don't have to always go in a precise order. But Dan, can you give us a brief summary of where U.S. energy production, consumption, trade balance, and the like stands and compare it to where we were a couple of decades ago? And let me start by saying, obviously, a number of things have changed around the world. In energy, shale, for example, is gigantic. But also Russia's invasion of Ukraine, new geopolitics with China being a potential major adversary, Europe and its energy issues, a tremendous increase in demand for electricity from AI. All those things are going on, but you're the expert, Dan, so over to you.
Well, I think, first of all, it's great to be here on behalf of all three of us. Very pleased to be on with you, Michael, and to be part of this series and the impact that the series has. In a way, you summarized it. I'll just say two things. One, if you compare it to where we were less than 2 decades ago, it's 180 degrees change in the U.S. energy position. The only question a decade and a half ago was how high would U.S. oil imports go? Now the U.S., because of the shale revolution, is the largest producer of oil in the world, largest producer of natural gas, the largest exporter of LNG. And that has had big geopolitical consequences because, Putin's effort to shatter the consensus support in Ukraine might well have worked were it not for the fact that U.S. LNG could replace a substantial amount of that Russian gas. I will say just one other thing to add to it. Obviously, we're going to get into what AI means for energy, but I think in many quarters, thinking has not caught up by any means with the change either in the energy position of the U.S. and what it means and its significance, including what it means for consumers in terms of prices. And it certainly, as we will get into, has not caught up to what we've learned over the last few years about the energy transition. But I know we'll pick that up in a few minutes.
Yeah, I should add, by the way, that Dan and co-authors have a really important piece in Foreign Affairs recently, and I refer everybody to that on exactly the topic he just mentioned. Arun, let's turn to you next. You've written in our series and been an advocate for policies that harmonize economic interests, national security interests, and environmental interests. So maybe you could give us a bit of an idea of the evolution of low or zero emission energy sources, the use over the same time span, and where they stand today. How far have they come? How far they need to go before they actually scale to something that's much more significant than they are now?
First of all, Michael, thanks for having all of us and leading the Tannenbaum series of articles. Let me start by just picking up where Dan left off. I think if you look at the history of shale revolution, it really started with technology innovation going back to the 1980s. And then it took about, 25 years or so to make it with the cost coming down over time that when I was in the DOE in 2010, it became cost competitive. And that has actually pushed out, coal, et cetera, that is more the higher emissions. So over that time, the technology evolution that you've seen also in solar and wind has actually brought the cost down substantially. I would also say that the Tesla Edison grid architecture was really not designed for solar and wind, but the evolution of gas that has come down is now balancing that, and so we can now add solar and wind to the grid, as well as the battery costs are coming down dramatically, and that's we are seeing on a daily level. The lithium-ion batteries cost has come down, and so from the electricity side, this is a really good. We have more options now. The only thing I would say is that the nuclear cost has actually gone up. It has a negative learning rate. And from what we are seeing right now, there's a nuclear, I would say, renaissance nuclear going on in terms of both the fuel cycle as well as the technology of the small modular reactor. So we are hoping that the cost would come down. But this has been the last, I would say, 20, 25 years has seen all these options, come around for the grid, which were frankly not there as cost effectively before.
Okay, so the grid remains a challenge.
The grid remains a challenge, as you were pointing out earlier. The demand growth that we're now seeing because of AI data centers is dramatic. I don't think the electricity sector has seen this kind of demand growth, and there's a huge amount, and I'm sure we'll get into it on terms of permitting reform to get transmission line and infrastructure to be built. That is one of the biggest bottlenecks going on in the United States right now.
Well, one of the things we've seen is an about-face, close to 180-degree turn on policy after lots of subsidies and mandates and regulations earlier in the Obama administration, but certainly in the Biden administration, lots of money being thrown at this by the federal government. We've seen an about-face in the Trump administration's policies, negating, reversing, limiting, challenging some of these. And for a while, I thought this was primarily going to be just the federal level, but actually Governor Newsom in California has done an about-face and is now encouraging fossil fuel production, trying to keep refineries open, trying to reform permitting along the lines you just said, Arun. I guess some people think this is because he's getting ready to run for president. He doesn't want an energy disaster in California to get in the way, but is this likely to continue? We've seen, Bjorn, many nations have made these announcements and commitments and, targets for energy transition, net zero, all these kinds of things. And where do they stand today? Has it done much for emissions? I know there have been studies that suggest many of these policies actually haven't done much, but you're an expert on this. You've looked at it carefully. What's your analysis of where this stands today, and maybe get us head in the right, where should we go in the right direction?
Well, thanks, Michael. It's great to be here. So look, fundamentally, the problem here is that for the US, and it's a fun sort of conversation, you've just had a lot of conversations about how you want to get more energy. For the rest of the world, or I should say for the rest of the rich world, you're right. This is mostly a conversation about climate. And a lot of nations, especially the European Union, where I come from, we've been very focused on emissions. But the reality, of course, is there's not much happening. Lots of promises, but very little happening. Look, remember, the world keeps getting better on what we call the carbon intensity, essentially the CO2 per dollar produced. It has come down certainly for the last half century or more, but it hasn't changed. It's gone down about 1.9% per year over the last 3 or 4 decades. And the Paris Agreement, which everyone thought was going to dramatically change how the world deals with the climate problem, has done nothing to change that. If we were actually going to reach our promises, we would have to see an 8% decrease every year. Instead, it is stuck around 1.9%. So we're just not doing this. We're not living up to the promises that we have made, and certainly most of the rest of the world is not really paying attention. So again, you have a few rich countries that are very focused on climate. You have a U.S., which is not really focused on, and of course you have a very large poor or poorer world, China, India, Africa, that are just much, much more focused on getting rich, and that is getting more energy. So we really have a very big difference between what most people in the world are concerned about and this climate conversation that we've had. Just one more thing. You also asked what was the impact on the security. And as Dan also mentioned, it has been very clear for Europe that you can have lots of solar and wind if you have lots of gas, as Arun also mentioned, but you really do need that gas. And we got it from Russia. That turned out to be really energy unsecure. And so again, we need to go back and say what makes you secure is, for instance, what the US has managed to do to have fracking and get lots of gas cheaply.
Well, let's pick up on that, Dan. You mentioned briefly about the geopolitics, but this is a tremendous change in the geopolitics from basically the Mideast and Saudi Arabia and OPEC being the swing producer to basically shale here having an important impact on the geopolitics. And maybe you could pick up on that and how in an era now where we're worried about Russia and China and great power competition again, some people even called it Cold War 2.0. Hopefully that's hopefully that won't really continue, but we certainly are worried about that. So how do you see how what's gone on in energy around the world, but importantly in the United States, affecting geopolitics?
Well, first I have to say, I wrote my very first book on the Soviet-American Cold War. The Cold War, now I call it the Soviet-American Cold War to differentiate it from what's going on right now, which is it's not a Cold War in a sense because you're highly integrated economies, which was not the case with the Soviet Union, but it is those geopolitical considerations of energy loom very large. Bjorn has already referred to it, and I have, that the absolute significance of U.S. shale gas. I was just talking last night to a deputy chairman of an European energy company who said everybody in Europe's against shale, but it was shale gas that saved Europe and really has saved Ukraine, because otherwise, without those imports of U.S. LNG, Europe could not have withstood the economic pressure because Putin was trying to use the energy weapon. He calculated it would work. He miscalculated because he didn't realize what the U.S. could do. So I think it has great geopolitical significance. The Chinese are very sensitive to energy. They import 75% of their oil. They worry about that in terms of rising tension. And so that, I think, is maybe the number one driver, not climate, for their diversification and their push for electric cars, among other things. So energy continues to be very geopolitical. There's one big question out there, Michael, whether we're kind of reaching a peak in terms of U.S. shale, its growth, and therefore, where will you meet the growth? And we just had this huge turnaround from the International Energy Agency, which had, as Bjorn knows very well, in Arun, this 2021 scenario of net zero by 2050. And suddenly they come out with a report saying that every year between now and 2050, you need $540 billion in new oil and gas investment just to keep the world running. That is a big change, $540 billion a year of investment. And that's from the International Energy Agency.
Yeah, that's really important information, Dan. We'll get back to innovation and investment and longer-term horizons and policy flip-flops affecting that in a minute. But Arun, you've written a lot about this intersection of energy and environment and national security and economic security. If you want to pick up on that at all, please do.
Yeah, I think, in my paper, the Hoover paper on, how do you balance the policy to balance the imperatives of national security, economic security, and environmental security, I think one has to really look at it in time scales. It's very important to look at it short-term, midterm, long-term. If you have a national security crisis today and you have to use oil and gas, you will use oil and gas. And that's that's a practical way to do it. Otherwise, you have a national security or an economic security. But at the same time, we cannot forget the long term. And I think the long term is that you have to develop policies. And by the way, the last thing the business community wants is fluctuating government policy. That is really bad. And what you really need is the stability in the policy that incorporates the environmental impact of the short-term thing, so that in the long term you actually take care of it, so that you balance out. So I think this the short-term, midterm, long-term is the way at least I think about it, and so that you are practically pragmatic in addressing all the three securities.
Well, I think that's an important point for everybody to keep in mind. We don't want to lose sight about that long run. Although, as Dan is suggesting, and perhaps Bjorn is also suggesting, it may be stretched out a little bit than the early optimism had.
Are you just saying a little bit?
Well, I mean, okay, for sure. A few decades more, absolutely. Okay, so let's go on then on this theme of what works and what will generate that innovation we need to drive the cost down, have various things scale, with two important points. First, Dan, maybe you could just say a word about the scale of energy, because I think most people aren't aware. They don't think in quadrillion this and terabytes of that and trillion of this. So it's important to appreciate to get some sense of how gigantic.
Well, I think that I mean that the energy, the total world consumption of energy is huge, and people don't realize that it's the foundation for everything else. That there's nothing. Our society doesn't work. We go back to the 16th century otherwise without it. And I think that was, in that foreign affairs article you mentioned, identified about 7 reasons that the energy transition is not turning out the way that was predicted 5 years ago during COVID, when demand went down and prices went down. And the starting point is simply the scale of the energy system. The energy system that supports, $115 trillion world economy. You can't change it that quickly. I went back in my book, The New Map, and looked back at all the other energy transitions. They took a long time. So there was almost a degree of hubris saying that you could transform the energy system of $115 trillion world economy, that might be $200 or $250 trillion in 25 years, that you could transform it in 25 years. It was just, I think that was the first sort of overstatement that underlay everything else.
And would you think that one of the lazy analyses was that we were going to replace fossil fuels rather than add to them and have a lot of growth coming?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think when you look at it, you say, okay, wind and solar has grown a lot from a small base, but it's grown a lot. It's 18% of China's electricity now. But conventional energy's grown a lot too. And at the same time continues to grow. So really you need to think in terms of energy addition rather than just energy transition. And I was struck in the golden state of California, the head of the State Energy Committee in the State Assembly just recently said, we've run out of magic wands. And even, I love the quote from Gavin Newsom, who said, we are all the beneficiaries of oil and gas. No one is naive about that. It's just that's where thinking is catching up with the complexity of this global energy system we have.
Bjorn, let's turn to you, because you've looked at a lot of these different policies, and we saw a lot of the policies, however well-intentioned, maybe overly optimistic in the potential outcomes. They were very costly enacted, and a lot of them were subsidies for various types of green energy, mandates for use, attempts to make it more difficult, refusal to allow pipelines and things of this sort. Looking in the U.S., and there's been a study of many of these around the world. What's your sense of how how effective they've been, and what's your sense of where a real serious long-run solution might lie?
Well, the real problem here is that the West, so the US and all the rest of the rich world, matters very little in the 21st century. And I think that's one of the things we keep forgetting. I mean, Dan was pointing out the world economy is huge, but most of the energy use in the 21st century, the vast majority of carbon emissions are going to happen in the not West. So not in the US and the EU and Canada, Australia, and so on. One scenario, obviously it's hard to predict into the future, but one scenario that's very popular sort of suggests that the rest of the 21st century will be about 14% US and other rich Western world emissions, and the rest will come from China, India, Africa, and so on. And so even if the whole rich world, so not just the EU, but also the US and everyone else, actually went net zero by 2050, it would matter almost nothing. If you try to run the two different things, one, the US and the EU just keep their policies as they were a couple of years ago, or one where they go net zero by 2050, the difference in the UN climate model shows that this is a difference in temperature by the end of the century about 0.2 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.1 degrees centigrade. It's just not going to matter. We won't even be able to measure it by the end of the century. And what that really shows us is, and I think that was also what Dan was alluding to, is what matters is what the rest of the world does. So first of all, it's very, very hard to keep having consumers and voters accept higher and higher prices. That's what they're learning in California, and that's certainly also what we're seeing in Europe when the UK and Germany and many others are seeing incredibly high prices because of all the policies that you just talked about. That is unsustainable in a political sense, but also, even if it were to succeed, it's just not what's going to matter for the rest of the 21st century. So I think it goes back to what Arun was really pointing out. In the short run, you really can't do anything, but in the long run, you can only cut carbon emissions and get people to at least somewhat transition if you get innovation that makes green energy cheaper than fossil fuels. It's just not going to happen if you have much, much more expensive green energy. Voters are just going to say no.
Yeah, I would say two things about that, and you want to comment on. First is a lot of the analysis, just for example, I'm looking at electric vehicles, looks just at what comes out of the tailpipe and doesn't do a full cycle analysis. And it seems to me that is one of the problems. So we have to look from really where the materials are mined, what methods are being used, how they're processed, how they're shipped, how they're deployed, et cetera, not just what comes out the tailpipe, to use an electric vehicle example. And it seems to me that that's a difficult concept to get across the public, who maybe they put solar panels on their roof and they're getting subsidized, and this is great. And they don't understand either the scale or the need to understand that somebody's paying earlier in the chain or somewhere else is subsidizing.
Could I dive in on that point?
Sure.
Just for a second, because I've been working on that. Right now, we're doing a study called Copper in the Age of AI. Electrification, energy transition, a lot of it's about electrification. An electric car uses 2.7 times more copper than a conventional car. AI is going to need a lot more in the system. There's a problem, which is the supply, as you say, of the raw materials of copper. It takes on average 16 years to open a new mine in the world, 29 years in the United States. And yet, when you look at all the numbers, including China's incredible advance of electric cars and batteries and everything, you got a double copper production, but just how that's going to happen. And I think that was one of the other things that was not taken into account in the thinking about energy transition, is that material constraint on it, where it collides with something else, which is the geopolitical clash between the United States and China, which is playing out exactly right now on rare earths because of China's predominant position in all of those mineral supply chains.
Arun, you want to pick up on that? Maybe you could talk about how dependent we are, what time frame we could, and what we need to do to change that to get those supplies made available. That's consistent with our national security and our economic security.
Sure, happy to say, but just want to point out that I think what Bjorn is saying, and I completely agree with that, after solving 10 different differential equations, it comes down to cleaner must be cheaper. And that's a research R&D, technological innovation, industrialization the right way. So I really want to point out that I think there's a real need for government R&D to really bring down, to outcompete other nations that are competing with us in terms of whether it's supply chain or others. And we can go into more detail, but I think that is the goal. And I think initially, any new technology to be competitive needs a little bit of help to come down the learning curve, and that's fine. But eventually, it has to be market-based and it has to be cost competitive. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. In terms of the copper, I couldn't agree more what Dan is saying, that as you electrify things in general, you'll need more copper. However, what also has to be accounted for is, and this is going in the engineering side, is the voltage. If you use higher and higher voltage, you need less copper because your current flow goes down. So that's why if you look at the grid that's going on, that is being built in China, they're not operating at hundreds of kilovolts. In the United States, the highest voltage is 765 kilovolts. They are operating at 1.1 megavolts, and they're testing out 1.4 megavolts because you need less metal. So you definitely need more copper, but you also can operate, and that's technology. That's
But Arun, in the transmission lines, don't they mainly use aluminum?
No, they use copper, and now we can get into the reconductoring.
Because we use mostly aluminum in our long.
Well, and copper,
I mean, copper in the distribution, and
but even in the data center, for example, the architecture of this, they use copper is used up there. But if you look at the architecture, if you go to higher voltages, you actually need less copper. And if you could get the voltage to the chip you'll operate at few volts. But you need technology to drop down from a DC voltage of tens of kilovolts to down to a few volts. And that is power electronics technology. And that is based on silicon for sure, but silicon carbide, gallium nitride. And the United States is the biggest producer of silicon carbide. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities out there to innovate as well. But Michael, you asked about the supply chain, and there are multiple factors out here. I mean, whether it's, lithium supply chain, we got to develop, local supply chain out here. There's no question about it. But in terms of the supply chain for example, nuclear fuels, we were buying our nuclear fuels from Russia and Kazakhstan, and we need to build that supply chain out here. But we just ran a workshop actually with Hoover in Washington, D.C. on graphite. And graphite is not only used for lithium-ion batteries, but also used as arc furnaces for steel making. And what we found is that most of the graphite we buy today, 99%, is from China. And if you want to replicate their technology out here, we'll never be able to compete. And so one needs to then out-innovate and come out cheaper so that you can actually build a supply chain out here. And that requires R&D. That requires new ways of making synthetic graphite. And so this is just one example. And I think you can go for magnets and all of that and all the various technologies that I think we need to have supply chains with the biggest component, the security part of it. We have to have some domestic or friend-shoring these technologies.
That's important to point out. Bjorn, you've long said innovation is really key. Maybe you could pick up on that. Are there some promises, maybe it's medium or longer term, for decarbonization that we're not really getting enough attention, that don't seem like over-promises? They may have been hoped for to come more quickly, but what would you say is some of the leading candidates for innovation in the future that we should be paying attention to, in addition to all the things, or maybe including all the things that Arun said?
So you're looking for investor tips, huh? Well, the truth is, I don't think any of us really know what's going to power the rest of the 21st century, and that sort of is inherent in innovation. We don't know where that could lead, but what we do know, and as Arun pointed out, we do need to have green energy that's cheaper. Otherwise, most people are just not going to pick it. We'll have a few rich, well-meaning countries that will do some of their emissions from green energy technologies. For the rest, we'll just simply focus on getting more energy. If we could make green energy cheaper than fossil fuels, eventually everyone would switch. So as Dan pointed out, nuclear is certainly one option. We're talking about fourth generation nuclear. These would be small modular reactors, possibly, that could be type certified at the factory. So instead of what we're currently doing, and that's one of the reasons, as Arun pointed out, that we're seeing negative learning or increase in cost for nuclear, that each nuclear power plant right now is being built as this opera house that's just this one unique place where we have to get everything right and everything just so, which of course makes it incredibly expensive. But imagine if we could type certify it at the factory, and then we could just ship out tens of thousands of these nuclear reactors in like a container size. That could dramatically change the world around. Remember, the only time when the world has really decarbonized more was during 1970 to 2000, when we had lots of nuclear being phased in France and many other places. This is the kind of way that we know could work. Again, we don't know whether fourth generation nuclear is going to be cheaper than fossil fuels. Remember, the other three generations were promised to be incredibly cheap, and of course that didn't turn out. But what we should do is invest a lot more in research and development to see if that promise comes true. It could also be geothermal. There's a lot of chatter around geothermal. We have lots of power essentially lying beneath our feet. And because of fracking, we now know how to drill much better. So potentially that could be incredibly cheap. And again, also deliver power 24/7. One of the things we haven't really talked about, but the big problem with solar and wind, of course, is that they're unreliable. We can't really determine when we get our sun or when we get our wind power, and we need power 24/7, which is one of the reasons why we need gas as backup. So if we could get these 24/7 power sources like geothermal, that could be a solution. Batteries could potentially also be a position forward, but it's going to require much, much more than what we have right now. So I'm a little skeptical about that. And of course, there's fusion, which is sort of the golden chalice. Is that the right word? But sort of the thing that we're all hoping would eventually happen, and that happens in all the sci-fi movies. But again, we don't know whether that's going to happen. We should be spending money on all of these things, because I don't know which one is going to take over and power the 21st century. I don't think anyone knows, but it's very, very cheap to do R&D on all of these areas, much, much cheaper than our current climate policies, and much more likely to work in the long run.
Graphite was mentioned. I noticed the other day that Exxon announced that it's getting into the graphite business. So we have some...
And it's already announced that it's going into the lithium business.
Yeah, so it's really, really an interesting... we'll see one of our leading multinational companies that's been a leader in oil and gas start thinking about these kinds of things and how they're going to affect the entire energy ecosystem down the road.
If I could say the point that both Bjorn and Arun made is about the importance of R&D and time. As Arun was speaking, I was thinking it took about 30 years for solar to get commercial. It took about 30 years for this thing that absolutely could not work. It was all the textbooks said wouldn't work, shale, to actually prove that it can work. And so, I think both of them are saying that maybe the single most important investment you can make is the investment in research and science, in technology, and maintaining that. And that system is under stress right now. And universities, research labs, they have a really critical role. They won't come up with the answer tomorrow, but what's the work that's done today because somebody is obsessed or some group is obsessed can have a big impact, as Bjorn says, in 25 years. So I think the flow of research money is absolutely critical underpinning of this whole discussion.
If I could just add, we do this all the time. This is the economic argument for research and development. There's a constant underinvestment in research and development across the world because it's very hard to do big innovation that's going to have an impact 40 years down the line because your patent will have run out. So essentially, it's going to be good for humanity, but it's not going to be good for your business, and that's why you don't invest in it. Remember, we do this all the time in medical research because we recognize that it's a good idea to spend lots of money on researchers who then investigate stuff that 40 years down the line turns into a patentable pill or injection that companies, pharmaceutical companies, will get rich from, but that we will survive longer with. We should do the same for energy, and we're just not.
Arun is right in the middle of that, in that whole issue, knows it firsthand what's happening.
So, Arun, I was going to turn to you to get some perspective. Obviously, you're a leader in what's going on at Stanford and leading university research institution, especially in this area. And others say this should go on in government, inside the government for national security reasons. Others say, well, it should be done in the private sector with greatly enhanced R&D tax credits. What's your view about how we balance all that out as we move forward?
And there needs to be feedback loops, which is why the engagement between universities and the industry is so important, because the feedback loop has to be feeding each other in a very positive way. I think the government's role, as was pointed out so well, is certainly to fund the R&D that is pre-competitive and an all of the above approach, so that the universities and national labs are investing in ways to not only do things differently, but eventually bring down the cost and make cleaner cheaper, right? So that's one. The government's role is also to create the right policies where the industry can not only pick up these technologies and scale them. The universities don't scale, national labs don't scale. And scale is super important on this. And scale them, but have the right, price for the externalities. And I go back to George Shultz and Schultz-Baker approach. If there's an externality, which there is in terms of CO2, price it. Let there be market-based approaches to do so. And we haven't gotten there. And the other thing the government can do, which I would add to the Schultz-Baker thing in terms of R&D and the externality pricing, is now we are seeing the biggest challenge is the permitting reform that is needed. Because otherwise, we are stymied. We can't build anything in the U.S. And so that's the other role for government, is to streamline that and make sure that things can be built, because we need to build things, whether it's for AI data centers or other things. We need to be able to build this. So the role of the government on this, fund R&D. If there are externalities from environmental and climate point of view, price them so that there's market-based approaches, and have sensible regulatory approaches to make sure that the public good is maintained. But it shouldn't take 5 to 10 years to build a single transmission line. That is just unacceptable.
Well, I think we all agree on that score, but also worry that we have these big swings from administration to administration. We support a pipeline, we stop it, et cetera. It makes it very hard to do long-run investment if you're a private firm. Dan, maybe you could pick up on that about the cost to the instability of the policies and how they're affecting long-run business decisions.
Well, I can certainly see it in terms of the commitments that companies make. There's a company I know that was seeking to build a transmission line to bring wind energy from Kansas to the upper Midwest, and it was supported by the last administration. It doesn't seem to be going forward at all. Lots of local opposition of the kind Arun talks about, judicial reviews and so forth. And so it does make it much more difficult to make those investment decisions when there isn't a certain sense of to borrow a phrase from Bjorn's organization, a consensus about it. Because, these investment decisions have a much longer life extension than that of a 4 or even an 8-year administration. So the tendency becomes to disinvest. And that's what's happening in California right now because of policies.
Absolutely. Actually, we're starting to see a change. Again, as I mentioned earlier, whether this is for his own potential presidential bid or not, we've seen the policy change to sort of lighten some of the regulatory load. that started with housing, and now it's headed into.
Well, and I think the point that Bjorn made about price is really important. If you look at those new kind of populist parties in Europe, which Bjorn would be more familiar with this, I mean, immigration is their number one issue, but high energy prices related to climate policy seems to be the other one. And if you take Europe right now, it's supposed to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP. It has this huge problem about competitiveness, that it's lacking competitiveness. And yet, so it's going to have to, and yet the governments are under huge financial strain. So it's going to have to whatever the goals are, it's going to have to redirect funding because it just doesn't have the largesse to do every single thing that it wants to do.
Absolutely, these are important trade-offs. And as Arun, you mentioned, harmonizing national security, economic growth, and environmental stewardship is a tough act, but it's something that has to be done. There are a lot of trade-offs. Bjorn, I think we seem to be talking, haven't said it explicitly yet, that the government trying to pick winners and losers isn't usually a very good idea. That maybe investing in generic, pre-competitive technology, R&D, is a good thing, and then turn over the marketplace and let everyone compete on a neutral level. Maybe, and I think Arun was referring to a revenue-neutral carbon tax as even though the word tax is very unpopular, but it's a way to put a price on an externality. But in any event, would you care to comment on that, on the attempts government have made to pick winners and losers, and what the outcome so far seems to have been?
Yes, Michael, it's never a good idea to have government decide what should be the winners and losers. And so I think it goes back to what Dan started out saying. Energy really underlies pretty much all of our economy across the world. And so you can't have politicians toiling about and deciding what should deliver that power, what should deliver that energy. That's a very bad idea. What you can have politicians do is to decide what should power in the future, because we're going to make sure that that becomes a cheaper option. So by all means, I mean, Arun, I love your optimism that we can get sort of a good carbon tax on everything. It hasn't had a very easy life journey so far, but economists would tend to say that's the right way to think about it. But I think really what's going to solve this problem is if you can find some energy source that's just so obviously cheaper that it doesn't really matter whether you got the externality priced right or not. We saw that very clearly with the shale revolution in the US, which I think was sort of a good example of what happens when you come up with a technology that just dramatically undercuts everything else. Remember, this was not intended at all as a climate policy. It was funded by George Bush and many others, but the fundamental point was just to get more energy. But it just so happens to make gas much cheaper than coal, and gas emits about half as much CO2 as coal. So it just dramatically dropped the U.S. emissions of CO2, because the U.S. switched from a large part from coal to gas. So if you have an innovation that just makes one thing cheaper, and preferably one that's green, you will see a switch. I mean, in that sense, we should have everyone else around the world fracking because it's a technology we already know works. And then, of course, we should move on. That's the way you go. So politicians should stay out of saying what's the right technology, but they should be funding lots and lots of research and development into green energy so that we will get more of these fracking revolutions and get that happening everywhere around the world.
Maybe we could stick with fracking for a second and shale. Dan, Arun, is there some reason why we haven't seen an explosion of fracking all over the world? I mean, obviously you need the geology to be right, and
well, I think that's, I can jump in there at least on part of it. I mean, you are seeing it in Argentina right now, where there is some confidence that you'll be able to make investment and still, recoup, your investment. But I was talking again to a company yesterday that there's opportunities in Europe, but it's a ideological, almost religious opposition to the idea of fracking. It's just the brand is so bad in Europe. But of course, the U.S. was particularly, the geology was particularly open to it. But there's, and you had an ecosystem, and you had independence, you had entrepreneurs. So you haven't seen it take off much elsewhere. And certainly in Europe, it's a no-no.
Arun, do we know anything about where the geology might be conducive, and if the policies change with more stability, the investment climate improve, where fracking could make a major leap forward in some other parts of the world?
Well, I think that if I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong, I think the biggest reserves of shale are in China. But in addition to the reserves, you also need water. And I think where the reserves are and water is an issue.
And the geology, I think, is more
geology. So the geology is there for the shale, but I could be wrong about this. But I think the availability of water is a critical need. I just want to, if you don't mind, Michael, just touch upon something that Bjorn said. I think the energy growth is not going to be uniform across the world. India, for example, you mentioned that, and I agree with you. It's got a massive growth coming because just economic growth, and the population is the largest population. It's still growing a little bit, but it's tapering off. I think they are importing oil from Russia now because they don't have oil reserves out there. And I think their transition to electrification of transportation, they've already done that in the rail. They want to do that in the transportation, is frankly an economic security issue and a national security issue, because they would like to, transition so that they can generate their own electricity and, essentially fuel their electric vehicles. So I think in some cases, the alignment of national security and cleaner technology and I think one should leverage that opportunity to really provide the security. And, cleaner can be cheaper, but cleaner can also be more secure.
Arun mentions India, and this goes back to the basic 2050 net zero goal. As Bjorn has said, two of the three largest emitters, China and India, do not have 2050 goals. They have 2060 goals, 2070 goals. Britain has a 2050 goal, spending a lot of money on it. Britain's emissions are 3% of China's. What Britain does will not really have much effect. And I do want to mention one technology that is having a big impact only very recently on the energy system, but in terms of promoting demand, and that is where you started, Michael, which is AI, which is suddenly utilities, which for 25 years did not need to think about demand growth, are trying to figure out how to do it. And one of the consequences of that is that it's bringing more gas into the system. It was fascinating to listen to Arun about what the technology of the voltage in the data centers, and maybe some of the expectations for the growth of electricity demand are exaggerated, but we see at least U.S. electricity demand for data centers going from 4% to 10 or 11 or 12% in 5 years. Maybe that won't happen, but that's an example of the technology having a big impact, but not in the way you are in terms of new supply, but rather creating new demand.
Absolutely. India, we were just talking about India. India has announced it wants a national AI policy, wanting to be AI hubs and AI centers and so on. And obviously, they're going to need a lot of electricity. And it's not just having electricity; it's a massive amount required at peak, and then it comes up and down depending on whether you're training, you're inferencing, et cetera, in AI. So it's a big challenge.
They're investing heavily in solar and wind. They're primarily based on coal today.
Yeah, they don't get off for coal if they can.
And they are open now. This is terrific to hear. There was a Hoover team that actually went out there to talk about nuclear. And actually, that is very refreshing to hear that they really want to lean into that as well.
I think a lot of places also think of this as a national security problem.
That's right.
We mentioned China and its immense investment in AI, and some people would say they're doing really well in some parts of it, and maybe not in others, and that the U.S. has to stay ahead. But you see countries in the Middle East, countries in Europe, countries in Asia, all announcing big ambitions with respect to AI. Some see an economic issue, some of a national security issue, and some just don't want to get left behind, and they're not absolutely sure. And of course, none of us can, as Bjorn was emphasized, none of us can really know where this is going to be 10, 20, 30 years in the future. But we know that this is going to be boosting demand for quite some time. There was an estimate by J.P. Morgan the other day that a sizable, a quarter to a third of economic growth last quarter was an AI data center build out. So this is a non-trivial thing, and It's really sparking something heavily in the U.S. It's already been going on in China, and it's spreading globally. So I think,
Michael, wearing your economist hat, isn't it pretty clear that the AI boom is almost more important than what's happened to consumer demand right now for economic growth in the U.S.?
well, it's certainly on a par. Let's put it that way. We don't want consumers to collapse. That would be really bad for the economy.
Yeah.
But the AI data center demand is really, really a big tailwind to the economy for at least for the next half dozen years. Where it winds up, what the technology is, where Microsoft and Meta and Oracle and all these companies, what technologies they use to get the electricity, what's co-located, what's gas turbine, what's fuel cells, what's other technology, small modular reactors, as Bjorn was mentioning, remains to be seen how all that plays out. I think they're going to try different things, and in different sites, it may be somewhat different depending on the factors that Dan and Arun here have been mentioning, what makes the most sense.
Michael, if I could just, because one of the things that are incredibly important, especially for AI centers, is they want power 24/7. You're right. They do need to scale up and down, but fundamentally they need this power 24/7.
Oh, absolutely.
And so while we can certainly talk about both India and China increasing their solar and wind, and they are, they're also just going to say, I mean, a large part, as Dan also pointed out, is just simply to be less vulnerable to oil when they switch, for instance, to electric cars. But at the end of the day, if they can't get 24/7 with solar and wind, which is going to be very hard, and they don't have enough gas, they will go back to coal because they do have lots and lots of coal. And so I really think, if anything, this sort of pushes forward our need to get this new innovation that'll actually fix not having everyone revert to coal.
Well, you mentioned coal, and that leads to geopolitics and energy mix. And it's important to note that Germany, for example, for a while was importing lignite because they wouldn't do nuclear, and Angela Merkel shut down nuclear. They had very, very substantial renewables commitments. There were issues with the grid, and they wound up importing coal. So I think, Bjorn, we've all emphasized this, but I think you just summarized it greatly, that whatever is going to work is going to happen. That's been based heavily on economics. Whatever our longer term needs are, people in the shorter term are going to, whether that's firms or governments, are going to do what they need to do to make it happen.
I'd also add that I think, especially in India, when you see fluctuation, that is managed today by hydro. And I think hydro provides a big balancing, service, which I don't know if you recall, when COVID happened, the prime minister said that, we should turn off the lights just in remembrance of people who are suffering and turn on the candles for a little while. And they turned off the lights, and actually there was a big drop in the power. And the only way they could manage it in this sudden drop of power was by modulating the hydro. So I think hydro plays a big role. Now, of course, Germany, I'm not sure how much hydro is there, but Switzerland is all hydro, and you'll know this better than I do. So I think that's another technology. And as was pointed out, in terms of baseload technology, geothermal is something that we should be really looking at carefully. One of the bleeding edge companies in that came out of Stanford called Fervo, which is now partnering with Google and all to provide geothermal electricity for data centers. And so I think that's the other option for baseload power. You do need something baseload in addition to solar and wind. But I think there's a lot of penetration and investment going on in solar and wind, with the diurnal variation being managed by storage right now in California, Texas, and other places.
So I think, Michael, I just heard you utter what we can call the Boskin axiom. You said, I wrote it down, whatever works, you said, it will happen. That's a memorable phrase.
And where we have lots of business firms competing here and around the world. We have governments making policies, et cetera. But in the end, they have to keep the citizenry happy. They have to prevent prices from becoming so high that there's a revolt, as Bjorn was saying, some of which is going on, as Dan mentioned, in Europe. Certainly in California, people are upset about it, and there's a lot of pushback. So there's a lot going on, but maybe we can conclude with a little bit about final word on politics and geopolitics. We mentioned this 180 shift from one administration to another and so on. It's important to have stability so firms can plan for the long-term investment. So I guess I would ask, on the political front, do you see any reason why we could be optimistic that we won't be bouncing back and forth in competing ways, depending on which party's in power and the like, that we can get some stability here or elsewhere in the world? Do we see some capability of having a political enough consensus to do a variety of things, whether that's permitting reform, whether it's higher voltage grids that may be people will not want in their neighborhoods, et cetera? All these things, do we see some ability to generate that, or to use a phrase that one of you used earlier, so that we could have a political consensus that's sustainable? Because we see in the public opinion polls, whenever there's an economic problem, concerns about the environment plummet to the bottom. People, economic concerns just dwarf everything else in that situation. So the question is, do you have any thoughts about how we might do that? And I'll ask one more question about the geopolitics of it all.
I think fundamentally, what happened with the global warming conversation was that it became so end of the world that in the U.S. one party, but in the rest of the world many parties went along with this end of the world sense that we had to do everything. We had to throw everything in the kitchen sink at this problem, and that means a very, very wide shift from administration to administration. If one sort of says it's the end of the world, you'll have sort of a Trump administration coming in and saying, oh, we're not going to believe it at all. I think if we could get back to a sensible sort of middle of the road sort of understanding, as you point out, permitting reform, I think there would be a lot of political understanding for that. And then a sensible approach. And I think one of the things that we've kept referring to here is get lots more R&D. So green R&D is something that's both incredibly cheap compared to climate policies and will actually deliver a lot of other things. As they, somewhat incorrectly said, we sent a man to the moon, but we got Velcro. That you will also get other innovations out of this kind of thing. That you'll get, better batteries for your cell phone, which will be great. So I think we could spend money on R&D and get a wide political sort of sense of consensus on that. And that would help a long way. So stop this end of the world, which is not correct, and stop the not happening at all, and get sort of a sensible climate policy. Yeah, there's a long-term problem, but we can also solve it sensibly by spending a lot more on green R&D.
Arun, you want to pick up?
Yeah, I would say that I'll take a global view on this. I think every country is starting from a different initial condition, and there are different constraints. And they need to think about, including the United States, the short-term, mid-term, long-term. And from a security point of view, the economic security, national security, and the environmental security. So I think the policies will be different in different parts of the world, and because they have their own imperatives out there. So I think from that point of view, if he could, this is where, and I definitely don't want to I want to make sure that the burden on climate is definitely on the G7 and maybe the G20. But I don't want a country in Africa that is trying to get out of poverty to be burdened by climate policies, because they have to live, they have to survive. So I think it is imperative that we take the climate policy and make sure that the biggest emitters come together and actually, address that. But something that we did not talk about, which I think is very important, is that the weather is changing. The climate is changing, and the data is suggesting that the temperatures are reaching extremes. That has implications on food security. That has implications on water security, heat security. And I think we really need to look at the climate adaptation part very carefully, in addition to decarbonization, because that may be more urgent than some of the other issues that we're dealing with. And at the end of the day, I think a climate policy for the long term or energy policy for the long term that takes climate into account is really important. Any fluctuation is really bad for investments and long-term investment in infrastructure.
Dan, I'll let you have a final word.
Well, I think that, we started talking about the importance of energy to the economy. And I think, and picking up on what both Arun and Bjorn have been talking about, that's very important for the developing world. If they don't have energy for development, then whatever our migration crises are now in Europe and North America, they're only going to get worse. And therefore, you need an ecumenical approach. You need natural gas as part of the development. And as Bjorn was talking, I was thinking, things got so apocalyptic in one direction that you get that reaction in the other direction, again, just so opposed, where what we've heard here is more in the center. And I think that I always go back, one of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill, when he converted the Royal Navy from coal to oil, he said safety and energy, basically said oil, but energy lies in variety and variety alone. So we want diversification of energy supplies, not overdependence. We need that spending on R&D, and that is such a small investment relatively, but so important. And then you need an atmosphere where these things can proceed, and that climate is an issue, an important issue, but one of many other issues, which is exactly where Europe is now, and it's really in a tough position. So I think maybe at the end of the day, the most important thing here of all is some clear thinking.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that, obviously, and I want to thank all of you for this informative and indeed enlightening discussion about a variety of facts that lie at the heart of debates about energy and the environment. So Arun, Dan, and Bjorn, thank you so much for participating in this Tannenbaum program on Fact-Based Policy podcast. If you'd like to learn more about this program, please go to hoover.org. If you have additional topics you'd like to have us discuss, please send them in, and we'll see if we can follow up in additional podcasts. And please go to hoover.org for informative essays, books, and podcasts about these important issues that we are producing in the Tannenbaum program and elsewhere at Hoover. And please follow up as best you can. This is only the beginning of a long conversation that's going to happen in the U.S. and Europe and India and China, everywhere else, and among these nations as we move forward to a more prosperous economy, but also one that is consistent with some environmental stewardship. So thank you again, Arun, Dan, and Bjorn, for this terrific conversation.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bjorn. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Likewise.
Thanks.
You've been listening to Factual Foundations of Policy, a production of the Tannenbaum program on fact-based policy, where we conduct impartial investigations into the most controversial public policy issues facing Americans. To read the essays discussed in the show, as well as other content, including episodes in this podcast series and other engaging, accessible, and educational content in written, video, and audio formats, visit hoover.org/Tannenbaum.